Gammage Cup by Carol Kendall. In Chapter 1, in the long far off of the land outside, brave Minipins lived, and some of them died. Lost are their treasures, buried deep, till the dry time came, and the world was sand. Then Minipins fled to the wetter land. Lost are their treasures, in the ground they sleep, and nobody knew that the Minipins went to the land of the river, where they live content. Lost are their treasures, and the secret they keep. All right, Minipins, or called the small ones, are lost people, but they knew exactly where they were. They lived beside the banks of the Watercress River in the land between the mountains. The Minipins lived in a snug and secure valley, completely surrounded by unclimbable mountains. There were 12 villages, starting with Watersplash at the top of the valley, where the freshest foam down the cliffs of Old Snowdrift Mountain, and at the end was Water Gap, where the waters were very rough and moved towards the mountain known as Frostbite. Frostbite had a tunnel that the only remaining Minipins on Earth had traveled under their leader, Gammage, to get to the Green Valley. The river was muddy, like all other rivers of the land. Rumor has it that the Minipins were running for their lives from a vicious band known as the Mushrooms. The Mushrooms would take the Minipins' carts after they entered the long tunnel. The Minipins were saved their lives by a miraculous rain, which then filled the riverbed and washed out their hunters. The rain had closed the underground passage to the land between the mountains, and the only ones who could enter were high-flying birds and Foley the balloonist. One of the 12 villages was Slipper on the Water. Legend has it the village got its name when the first Minipins paddled their boats up the Watercress to explore their new valley. At its very spot, Gammage lost his left slipper. For 3 days and nights, the slipper floated in the exact spot, never moving once, even with the current. Obviously, this was something not to be ignored. 10 Minipins stayed at that spot, building their cottages, establishing their watercress beds, and started families. No real records were found of the land of the Minipins, but Walter the Earl was convinced that they existed. They had many ancient parchment that only he could decipher, speaking of treasure buried in the village, possibly in his very own garden. Walter the Earl then dug up his garden and probed at the walls of his house in search for the treasure in ancient scrolls. Now it is the year of Gammage 880. Slipper on the Water was no means an ordinary village. There were few villagers known as the Periods. Periods were special. Everyone agreed to that. Not only did they have a special way of spelling their names, but they wore a special air of dignity, and of course they held most of the village's offices. Everything had been this way in Slipper on the Water ever since the time of Foley and the balloonist. For that the Periods were the descendants of Foley, and that explained everything as far as the villagers were concerned. It was 440 years ago that Foley sailed away over the cliffs of Snowdrift in a balloon, which was the first, last, and only balloon made in the land between the mountains. Foley then 129 days later sailed back, bringing him a case full of curiosities from the land beyond the mountains. The balloon then burst when he landed, scattering the contents including Foley. When Foley was picked up, he had no memories of what he had seen in the land beyond the mountains. If he did not keep a book filled with notes, his existence would have only been a legend. There were 3 Minipins in the village who were usually referred to by everyone as O, them, and they. They lived alone, they wore clothes of outlandish colors, and they never worked properly at anything. Walter the Earl spends his time digging holes in his garden in search for the treasure. Curly Green was usually seen on her stool in a corner of the marketplace painting pictures, and Gummy was bone-addled. There was also Muggles. She could not be in the category of them, but she wasn't just an ordinary villager. She was a caretaker of the Foley curiosities in the museum. She was a candy maker, but she made the Minipin housewives distressed because she kept her house in awful state. Muggles woke up in a panic, thinking that she overslept. She looked outside and thought to herself, how very odd that it is still dark. What could have happened to the sun? She wondered why today of all days the sun was late, because the mayor was coming home from the big meeting. Muggle, still convinced that she overslept, pondered with questions as to why no one was awake. Then in the horizon she saw a line of gold fire on top of the sunset mountains in the west. She thought that there was something wrong about that too. Suddenly she hears footsteps of someone. Then she recognizes the figure of Gummy. He was coming from the street, going to the river. He had then gone into Walter the Earl's house. Muggles thought that all of this was getting weirder and weirder. She kept an eye on the house of Walter the Earl, and soon enough, both Walter the Earl and Gummy exited his house and looked up at the sky, and the fire in the mountains had disappeared. Muggle slid back into her bed, trying to figure out all if this was just a dream. She then thought to herself, "What a ninny I am. It's not the sun that's late, it's me that's early. I was having a dream. I might have known when I saw the sun rising in the west, it was a dream. But what a queer dream to have. It seems so real." Muggles then went back to sleep. Meanwhile, the sun rose in the east. When the sun hit Muggles, she had overslept. She jumped out of bed, trying to find her clothes on her messy floor. Muggles had a feeling that today was not like any other day, that today was filled with excitement, that something not altogether pleasant was about to happen. Today was a special day, with the mirror coming home from Water Splash. Down the street, going to the river, Muggle sees the town clerk's bald head shining as he strung up decorations on the dock. Minnie the money keeper stood at the bottom of the ladder and glared at him. Muggle sang a chant that Gummy had written in her head. "Oh, Minnie was stingy, so everyone said, with gold in his closet and under his bed. Oh, Minnie was stingy, so I've been told. He never did aught but count out his gold. Oh, Minnie was stingy, 'tis said oft enough, I'd say myself, believe I that stuff." Instead of crossing directly to the museum, she kept going right. She slowed down as she passed Gummy's cottage, but there was no sign of him. Neither was Curly Green to be seen. Muggles gazed at Curly Green's door, and suddenly it swung open, and there was Curly Green. They moved off towards the museum, crossing the small road going nowhere. Muggles paused and admired the distant sunset mountains. "I wonder what they're really like, the mountains," she said, remembering her strange dream. She would have liked to have told Curly Green about the dream, but dreams lost their wonder when you told them. Curly Green says, "Gummy says that they are full of old gold mines, silver too, probably. Walter the Earl says mini pins used to be great miners." Curly then states that she thinks that she should go with them. Muggles was filled with emotion after hearing about the gold and silver, and pondered on what a mine was like, and how did Gummy know so much about the mountains. A fearful thought struck her as she asked Curly Green if Gummy has been there. Curly then explains that of course, how else would he know about the mines? Muggles thought that she should really be getting to the museum, and that she should not be getting mixed up with them. Curly explains that Gummy goes all the time, and that he had built himself a house on the trickles up near the mountain. Shocked with news, Curly then made the suggestion that Muggles could come too if she would like. "Oh no, I wouldn't, cried Muggles. Muggles explained that she must go to the museum for the mirror's homecoming, and that her and Curly Green should talk some other time. When Muggles entered the museum, she saw that Curly Green was on top of a pile of dirt at Walter the Earl's house. She saw that he was talking and pointing at the direction of the sunset mountain. Muggles had to convince herself that it had nothing to do with the dream she had. Muggles begins to dust off the Gammage slipper, Fooley's balloon, and also Fooley's book. And the book had a list of strange words neatly printed in Fooley's handwriting. Fooley could never remember what any of it meant, but his wife was sure it was names of friends he had made in the land beyond the mountains. Muggles dreamed of the morning, which had been crouching at the back of her head, leaped suddenly sharp, clear into her mind, the line of orange fire on the mountains, Gummy pointing to it, Walter the Earl plunging his spade into the ground. Muggles then thought to herself that maybe what if it hadn't been a dream? Scarcely aware of what she was doing, Muggles walked out the door of the museum and across the cobblestone to Walter the Earl's house. Curly Green was sitting with her back to the willow tree. "You've come back," said Curly Green. Muggles explained that she wanted to talk to Walter the Earl. Curly and Muggles heard clanking, huffing, and scrambling noises, and to find it was Walter.
Oh, we're still on.
Curly and Muggles heard clanking, huffing, and scrambling noises, and to find it was Walter the Earl covered in filth. He stood confidently on top of the mound, straddling the iron box. He then saw Curly Green and Muggles below him. He smiled and raised a sullen hand, and his voice rang in sunlit morning. I have found the ancient treasures. In Chapter 2, the ancient treasures, Muggles felt the blood pound into her head. Curly Green glanced at the marketplace to make sure no one was looking. She stated that Walter the Earl better get out of sight, or else it will be taken away from him before he even gets to look at it. Walter the Earl explained that the iron box wasn't all. There were boxes and boxes, and agreed that no word must be spoken about this. Walter the Earl then invited Curly Green and Muggles to come see for themselves. Muggles gazed at the hole with astonishment. It went deeper, and there was a solid wall of stone which it exposed. At the bottom of the pit were pieces of rock which Walter the Earl had chipped out of the wall just above to make an opening to crawl through. They all skidded down the hole. Iron boxes lined the walls to the wooden ceilings. Iron boxes were stacked in the center of the floor. Iron boxes were everywhere the eye looked. Walter the Earl continued to open the iron boxes. One contained an old black piece of iron, which they all figured was a knife. The next box contained a mask. Walter Earl put the mask on and had Muggles and Curly Green hand him the other pieces that were in the iron box, helping Walter the Earl into the light metal garments. They set to work more quickly, shifting boxes about and prying open lids. There were more of the knives in the metal bodies. Curly Green continued to rummage and found a long gold tube ending in flaring edges like trumpet flowers. Puzzled, she examined it and thought, was one supposed to blow into it? A fearful blast exploded against the four walls. Muggles shrieked, and Walter the Earl staggered back. They all questioned of what that was. Curly Green did not know what it was, but figured it was something that should be blown into. Walter the Earl wondered if it was some sort of music pipe. Muggles then added nobody could hear it without running all the way to the Sunset Mountains, so it could not be used for music. Walter the Earl then came up that it was something to frighten the enemy, and that perhaps the ancient scrolls would tell all about their discoveries. Walter the Earl then took out a scroll and continued to read the old writings, explaining everything that they had found in the tunnel. Walter the Earl then picked up the black knife and examined it, and then suggests that the answers lie here. Muggle suddenly says, trumpet. That's what the horrid noise is, a trumpet, because it looks like a trumpet flower. Suddenly, they all heard a noise coming from above. Somebody was standing on top of the mound of dirt. There was slipping and sliding, and the next moment, the light from the opening was blocked off. A voice exclaimed, well, I'll be bound, he's underground, and what a pleasure, he's found the treasure. It was only Gummy. Gummy then rhymed, oh my hat, oh my shoe, oh my nose and ear, you'd better find an exit quick, the town clerk's nearly here. The group of thems jumped in alarm and concern about the treasure. Co's hopping mad. If we don't fill up that hole outside within the hour, he's going to put Walter the Earl out of his house for good. They all realized then the treasure would be lost again. Walter the Earl then suggested that they use the trapdoor that he found when he first found the tunnel. One by one, they all left the iron boxes and opened the trapdoor and landed in Walter the Earl's fireplace. Chapter 3. When Muggles parted from her new friends 2 hours later, she was almost bursting with excitement. Ahead, she saw Wim, the official village poet, bearing down on the museum. He was prickly kind who made a fuss about everything, but he was very important. But she needn't have worry this morning, for Wim was the throes for composing a welcome poem. Muggles and Wim then bantered back and forth about the Fooley poem and discussed the poem in detail, when all of a sudden, Walter the Earl enters and told Wim that he was wrong on what his interpretation of Fooley poem was, and Walter the Earl then gave his interpretation. After their banter, Walter the Earl explains to Muggles that Foley was not wise, and that his balloon happened to be made by the village toy maker for a fun fair. He then explained that he learned all of this in the scrolls, and that Foley was a fool. Scared that someone will hear Walter the Earl, Muggle suggests that he should hide because she heard footsteps coming towards them. Walter the Earl was not frightened. He opened the museum door and was expecting a rage of mini pins coming after him, but instead, in the very center of the marketplace stood that lamppost where Edshu's reed light burned at night, and tacked on the post was a notice newly put up by the official village painter, whose spelling was even worse when he was in a hurry. Everybody noticed. A message has been received by a special boat that Lidded the mayor will not return until tomorrow, and then will make an important announcement affecting everybody. Grand holiday proclaimed. Chapter 4. Muggles thinks to herself that she must find out about her dream, but every time she is about to ask, something else happens. She made her way through the crowd of mini pins, looking for either Gummy or Curly Green, but couldn't find them, and gave up and went home to make a pot of turtle soup. Once simmered at the right amount of time, Muggles receives a knock at the door. Mingy the money keeper stood at her door and claimed, "Co said there are to be free gobstoppers for the children tomorrow," he snapped. "Free? Just because the money comes out of this box, he calls it free?" Mingy gave the money box a shake. It had a comfortable fat chunk sound. "That's not all. May I come in?" Muggles offered a pot of her soup and found an old stool for Mingy to sit on. Mingy then continues on his rant on gobstoppers, the fresh paint for the merry-go-long, and now a banner saying "Welcome Home, Lidded," to be strung on the dock. Muggles then suggested that instead of gobstoppers, that she maybe could make something a little bit different. Mingy didn't care, but explained not to expect extra money for it. Mingy continued to explain that Walter the Earl should be outlawed by whim. He then explains that Co is muttering against Gummy and suggests that Muggles stay away from them before she gets mixed up in something. Mingy finished his soup and left Muggles home. Muggles then goes on to making little mint candy folk that she called Minty Pins. Muggles then began to experiment with candy clouds for the Minty Pins. An hour later, she surveyed the trays of Minty Pins with pride. Muggles then thinks about her dream and about the sword, if Walter the Earl had found out the secret. She put on her cloak and thought that one more visit to Walter the Earl couldn't get her into trouble. She also promised to give him some polish, an excuse she could give to anyone asking as to why she was visiting one of them. Muggles thought that it was also only fair that if he was being outlawed, she should warn him. Muggles then travels to Walter the Earl's house. Once she arrives at his door, he opens it and says, "There's no doubt about it, the black knife is a sword. I haven't discovered the secret yet, but I've come across things like flashing sword and righteous swords gleaming. Their blinding light, a curse upon the enemy." Walter the Earl then read the script below the painting that he found in one of the scrolls, Golden Mountain, home of the mini pins, and then claimed that this is where Gammage came from and where we all came from. Walter the Earl wants to share this news with the mayor, but Muggles then explains to him that Wynne is saying that he should be outlawed and that he should not share any of this news. Muggle then tries again to explain her dream to Walter the Earl, but he doesn't bother to listen. Muggles then leaves his house and starts to head towards Gummy's house and hopes he should listen to her dream. She found Gummy. He asks what brings her for a visit. Suddenly, Muggle feels embarrassed. Of course her dream was just a dream. Muggle then asks, "It wasn't a dream, was it?" Confused, Gummy asks what wasn't a dream. And Muggle says, "Seeing you go across the marketplace early this morning, all dripping wet, and talking with Walter the Earl, and pointing up at the thing I thought was the sunrise on the Sunset Mountains." Her eyes accused him. "You were coming from your other house up the little trickle because you had seen the sunrise. only you knew it wasn't the sunrise. Her voice flatted, then steeded. It's fires on top of the mountains, isn't it? There is somebody or something up there, and they're trying to get into our valley. That's why you talked to Co. But Co wouldn't believe you. So it wasn't a dream at all, was it? No, said Gummy softly. Odd as it may seem, your dream was not a dream.
Chapter 5 starts out with Gummy then explaining what happened that night. He says he woke up from his roof leaking and saw the fire on the mountains, and he didn't tell Co because he didn't want to wake him up in the middle of the night. So he went to Walter Earl, and he started digging for the treasures out of inspiration, as he said it. And then Muggles gets mad at him because he won't focus on what they're talking about. And she tells him to stay up that night because he needs to see the fire again. That night she stayed up by herself because she knew that Gummy wouldn't stay awake under a sound roof, but there's no fire on the mountain that night. When she got up, she cleaned the museum, and then when she was done, she went over to Walter the Earl's house and found children over there, as Walter the Earl showed them his swords from the treasures. And she almost stopped him, but then she didn't want to get involved, so she walked away. She was told that Co needed string for the banner that they were putting up, saying "Welcome Home," lidded for the mayor. And when she got over there, Geo fell from the ladder, and the banner wrapped around his head, and Co yelled at Muggles because she didn't help. And then he yelled at her for wearing an orange sash and to take it off. She was mad, but she took it off anyways. But when the mayor started to come, she put it back on because she thought, well, she took it off, and so that counted. So she put it back on, and while she was dancing in the marketplace, Lidded showed up and started dancing with her, and she started to tell him about her dream, but she said it was just a dream because she thought that he wouldn't believe her. When he started talking, he announced that there was going to be a competition between the villages to win a prize, and whatever village was the best village got the prize. And there would be 3 judges to come and survey each village. And then Walter the Earl started to tell about the fires on the mountain, but they all accused him of lying. So they moved on, and then Lidded announced that the prize would be the Gammage Cup. In Chapter 6, they started their preparations for the judges. They painted their houses and their doors new and re-roofed their houses. And then Muggles tried to find Gummy but found that he was missing, but thought that he was just on one of his expeditions. And then Curly Green painted her door, but instead of painting it green, she painted it scarlet. And everyone had a big fit about it and said it was ridiculous. But Muggles spoke up and said that she prefers scarlet to green anyways, and it was nice to look at. And everyone frowned upon her for that. And then later on that day, she was in the museum, and Walter the Earl came to her and said that the family tree and the paintings were switched and that they were the other way around. And so he switched them, and then Coe came and banished Walter the Earl from the museum and said that Muggles had to fix it. And at first she said that Walter the Earl was right, but decided that that wasn't a good idea. So she fixed them, and then that night she saw a figure in the marketplace, and it was Gummy, and he was all wet and tattered and dirty, and said that he fell into the river, and that he had something in his right hand pocket, and it was a twig that was half burned that blew off the mountain, but it must have fallen off in the river. So he stayed the night at Muggles' house, and later on that night, Muggles woke up and saw someone in the marketplace heading towards Curly Green's door, and she followed him and saw that he was painting her door green, and so she went back to her house and grabbed paint and went out and painted her door orange. In the morning, people noticed that Curly Green's door was green and that Muggles' door was orange, and Reedy says, right or wrong, it's Curly Green's door, and Geo had no business meddling with it behind her back. But Bun, the baker's wife, said, but Geo being a period now, if it was someone ordinary like Dingle or Spill or Thatch that did the painting, we should know at once it was wrong. But with Geo being a period, well, that's a difference, Reedy. Periods know what is right and what is wrong, said Dingle the Miller. It has always been that way. Don't the periods hold their high offices because of their wisdom? Everyone agreed, and so no one was offended that he did such a thing. And when Walter the Earl and Gummy found out that Curly Green's door was painted green, they painted their doors blue and yellow because they were offended by it. And the villagers made a fuss about them ruining the Gammage Cup competition for them. When Muggles woke up, she went to the museum and saw a notice saying that the first spring meeting was after tea and that it was important. In Chapter 9, the meeting started, and Curly Green, Mingy, Walter the Earl, Gummy, and Muggles all sat in the same spot, and no one else sat by them. And the mayor started talking about the Gammage Cup competition again, and offered more suggestions about what to make their village better. And Coe said, that all the roofs should be done, and Mingy made a big deal about how much money it should be, and that it should go to a sick fund instead, and everyone disagreed with him. And then Geo sprang up and said that they should all have green doors and green cloaks, so that they all matched. And Lidded addressed the matter of color and asked Walter the Earl to say something. And he said that he painted his door blue because he objected to someone sneaking out at night and painting Curly Green's door without her consent. And then Lidded asked Gummy to say something, and he said this poem. When the sun is shining on the trees, dappling green with gold ease, and spring is bursting in every part, I must wear yellow over my heart. And Curly Green said that she didn't realize that her door was so offensive and that she thought people enjoyed looking at it. And everyone disagreed with her and said that she was lying and that it was just excuses. And then Lidded told Muggles to say something, and she said, I don't know much about things, but well, it seems to me what I mean is, well, I don't think it's doors or cloaks or orange sashes, it's us. What I mean is, it's no matter what color we paint our doors or what kind of clothes we wear. We're those colors inside us. Instead of being green inside, you see, like other folks. So I don't think maybe it would do any good if we just changed our outside color. We would still be orange or scarlet on the inside. And well, we would do orange and scarlet things all the time, and everyone would still, and then she didn't finish her sentence. But Minji agreed with her, saying that he likes green, but he would prefer brown instead because it doesn't show the dirt. And he doesn't think he's green on the inside though, but brown instead. And then Ko made a big deal about Walter the Earl changing the signs in the museum for the painting in the family tree and said that they must be outlawed. And everyone was shocked because no such word was ever said in the village. And Walter the Earl speaks up and says that won't be necessary. We have no wish to set many pins at odds with their consciences, nor do we intend to stand in the way of their winning the Gammage Cup. We are not lampreys, but neither are we flies to be swallowed by trout. So tomorrow morning we shall take leave of this village to settle elsewhere. In short, we are outlawing Slipper on the Water. And then he turned away and walked out, and Curly Green, Gummy followed him, and then after a moment, Muggles and Minji walked out with them, with Minji leaving the money box on his chair. The next morning, at the start of chapter 10, they are on the river and they're ready to leave. And Muggles thinks back and says that Reading Crambo came to help her pack. And they wanted to take all the things she wasn't going to take with her, but she couldn't let go of them. And it seemed as though the villagers somehow found their way to the dock, and they gave them a bunch of stuff to take with them, like a batch of bread and flour, candles, and other things that they could use with them on their journey. And then they took off, and Muggles looked back, but then she decided that it wasn't worth it and that she needs to leave it behind. And when they arrived at the knoll, they saw Gummy's house, and it was described as a haphazard collection of stones fetched from the rock outcropping at the northern base of the knoll and slapped together with river clay. It was really small, and but there was a chimney and a fireplace, and the roof leaked on one side, but there was running water in the house. And then they decided to sleep outside because there wasn't enough room with all their stuff inside the house. They ate some food, and Gummy decided that Curly Green decided that it would be called a picnic, as eating the food outside. And then they went to bed, and that's when chapter 11 starts.
Okay. So it seems like over the 3 days that they spend at the knoll, things are kind of disorganized, and Muggles, who had originally been explained as a simple-minded person, started to stand out as a leader. She saw how things were and understood that they needed to have shelter and food, that these things weren't going to be available to them as easily as it had in the village. And I think the other people weren't quite on the same page yet. At one point, instead of being the untidy person, she says, what we need is more order in our work. Muggles went on, we're going about it so untidily. I do dislike untidiness. She kind of encourages them to get started and working. And I think what she does that really gets them to work together is that she doesn't push them. She just kind of leads by an example. And, the others are kind of looking at her like, what do we have to do for all these things that you're doing, for us? And she tells them, you don't have to do anything, Muggle says slowly, but if you want to do something, well, I have sort of an idea about things that you'd like to hear. And she starts to explain the things that need to be done. And I think that the rest of the group, Walter the Earl, I almost said Walter the Grey, Walter the Earl and Minji and Curly Green, they kind of start getting into it, and they want to participate and work on things, and they end up getting together like a fish garden, and they start working on this house that before had been coming together slowly, bits and pieces, lots of breaks together. What Muggles finds is that with, maybe working a little bit hard in the morning and then having some play in the afternoon, that's the best way for the group to work. And everybody's kind of excited and into their thing, and everybody has their task. Everything gets done, and then they go out and go for a boat ride, and they manage to get more things for their garden at the same time. And people really are looking at her as a leader, and they're having ideas of their own of things that they want to do. It says Muggles, who as far back as she could remember had never been consulted over the simplest matter, gravely gave her consent over one of the people actually volunteering to build a shelter for them. It just talks a lot in this chapter 11 about them bonding and thinking of things that they want to do in their adventures after they're done doing their work. They decide that the next day that they want to go maybe to the mountains to explore. That's what Walter the Earl would like to do. As they're kind of like getting along, Muggle starts to worry that they don't like her because maybe they think that she's too pushy, and they seem to be kind of going off secretly to do their own thing. But then it turns out that they're very grateful to her for kind of, pushing and motivating them, and they even made her her own cloak with orange cloth and jewels. They're all pretty proud of themselves. And it says for chapter 12, by the next morning, the outlaws had their second wind. They've been working quite a bit, and the walls of their new house grew so high that the builders had to stand up on piled barrels and chests to lay the stones. When the last stone was plastered into place, Walter the Earl was so carried away with the accomplishment that he began to dig a storage cellar between the two houses, being, as he pointed out, something of an expert on digging, which is kind of funny. They decided then to go out and have a picnic and explore the mountain. While they're walking there, they do start to find some gold. Minji doesn't think anything of it. It's not much trouble, he says. And then the others are kind of thinking of using it as decorations, maybe making it into a cloak. And then they kind of move on. They go to the mountains. They start to explore the tunnels. And it's kind of scary for them. Some of the people are kind of panicking a little bit. It's really dark. And then they start to hear something. They're kind of hearing something. They're hearing a tap, tap, tap. And then they notice that their sword, Walter the Earl had brought with him, started to glow. Where it had been black and ugly before, now it glowed faintly with an inner radiance. Then the tapping that they had heard suddenly disappeared, and the sword that Walter the Earl was carrying went back to black. It was kind of creepy. They didn't like being in the mountain anymore, so they kind of left, went and had a picnic, collected some gold, talked a little bit maybe about the tap-tap that they had heard was only water dripping, trying to find other reasons for something that maybe wasn't as scary. And that was the end of their day. The next day, Gummy and Muggles have to return to Little Trickle to return the boats that they had borrowed, and also so Muggles could get some of the things that she had left behind that they needed. When they got to the village, they noticed that some things had changed. Everything was pretty much identical. Anything that had given it some kind of personality was gone. Let's see, sorry, I just forgot my train of thought. They ran into somebody named Spell, who made a comment about Minji, and it seems that they're kind of understanding that things are changing. They're seeing things maybe not that these people were so bad, maybe. Spill had said, Minji always said it was the money box helping me out, but Rose, he's the new money keeper, says that's impossible. So it looks as though I owe Minji. So maybe Minji wasn't the stingy person after all, but they kind of were like, oh, he pinched us the pennies. It seems like he was actually adding his own money into the pot to help people, and, you know, that always seems to be something you find out later. So Muggles suggest, you know, maybe instead of owing him the gold pieces that you're saying that you owe him, maybe you can give him a favor. Maybe you can help him out if ever he's in trouble, and Spill seems to like that. As they go through the village, going on to the person who has Muggles' belongings, they're starting to find out more things, like if people are kind of found sitting idle, they're going to be fined. They find out that the village is kind of trying to erase the memory of Walter the Earl and Curly Green and Minji and Muggles and Gummy. The kids are being told, you know, you're going to be punished if we hear these names from you. We don't want to hear anything about swords. They're trying to make things as perfect as possible for when the judges come through. While Gummy and Muggles are collecting their items, the rest of the gang are back trying to make a roof for the house, for the second house that they're building. They find that the daggers that they're using don't really work with cutting the willow, so they decide to try and use the swords that they had brought along, and they find that those are really, really beneficial. But also they make a comment about how the swords are so sharp and they instantly sever the twig from the trunk, but they don't hurt the individuals themselves. It says, you see, it doesn't hurt us, it only hurts other things. So just basically talks about them working. It's noticed that, you know, Walter the Earl has maybe snuck off during the morning to go and kind of look more at the mountains. He's referring to his parchment. They notice after a while that it's kind of quiet and it feels like something's approaching. And, you know, at first I thought, well, maybe it's coming back with Gummy and Muggles, but it's not that. The swords start to approach, to glow again. Like the blackness of night giving way before the slate gray dawn, the sword in his hand was changing before his transfixed eyes. And it changed, it grew less heavy. They also noticed that the blade was starting to have writing appearing on it. And as it glowed, that whatever felt like it was approaching, it then like kind of subsided and it backed away. And then again, they could start to hear the birds chirping again. So there's something out there that's coming. Meanwhile, back at the village, Muggles and Gummy are collecting the items that they need, and Muggles is, you know, trying to talk to her friend Reedy, who had saved all the stuff for her, and you know, she's worried about what's going on in the mountains, and she tries to warn Reedy. Reedy listens, suppose that we should be in great danger, but Reedy doesn't really want to hear about it. She wants Muggles and her friend out of there. She doesn't want to hear it. You know, Muggles really wants to talk to her about it, but no. Reedy isn't mean. She's not being mean. I think it's just maybe more like the danger of knowing that she's talking to them, that, you know, she'll get in trouble, because she does give them some food to take with them, and that wasn't something that was asked for. You know, she's telling them, if you see any of the periods, it might explain you only came here to get your stuff, not to like come and socialize. Once they've left with the items that they need, the Gummy and Muggles run into Lidded. And Lidded starts talking to them and saying, I think we might have been hasty. maybe, there are some injustices on both sides. You did a little something, I did a little something. Maybe when the judges have gone through, you can come back, be quiet, you can come back, But Muggles doesn't want to do that. She doesn't want to go back to being the poor, simple old Muggles as though she's never been away. She's kind of found herself. She feels good about herself. She's a leader. She feels good with the people that she's with. I think before they were so lonely. Everybody was individual, and now they're a family, and she doesn't want to go back to being lonely anymore. And she's found that she's strong. So she says no, and then they're on their way back home. When they come back, they can't really find anybody, and they don't really know where they are. Eventually, the other group comes back, and I think that they went looking for them. Sorry. And they come back. They talk about the swords. Kind of are all scared a little bit. And then they're talking like they think that the Earl says there is something in this valley besides the many things. They don't know how they're because there's not really any access, and it comes to the conclusion that they're coming through the mountains. The tap 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 that they heard are the pickaxes chipping away through the mine. They decide the reason for this is the gold, and Muggles she looks at the others in dismay and says, all this time while life went calmly on in the valley, something had been nibbling away at their peace, looking to destroy them even as they tended to the watercress beds and fished the streams. So they talk about they seem to be safe as long as they have the swords, because the swords can protect them. There's what kind of pushing away the presence of the others that are coming. Then they talk about, but who's going to protect the rest of the valley? And, they say, well, I guess it's up to us. Then it's decided, well, how are we going to convince them that this presence, and they believe it's the mushrooms, how are we going to protect them? So they decide that they have to go and find proof. So Minji decides, hey, I'll go and do that. I'll go and kind of scout it out, and then there's a discussion on, well, maybe Gummy should do it, blah, blah, blah. And then they come to the conclusion, though, that Walter the Earl knows most about battles, and that's his job. Gummy is the fleetest and ablest with his tongue, so he must go to Slipper on the water for help if we need it. Curly Green and I will undertake to defeat anybody who comes from the village and help with the armor. I think you know that Minji is the one to go. He won't lose his head no matter what happens. If he should be captured, he will know how to take care of himself so Minji will go alone to the mountain. And then what they decide is that they'll kind of observe from far while Minji is scouting things out. They go about this plan. Minji is watching, and then he starts to see these mushrooms pouring out from the mountain, and he says there's 200 plus. He's taking notes with a little wax pen on the rock, and he finds that he wants to leave, but they're very sharp of hearing, and so any slight noise that he makes gets their attention. So he's kind of like, what am I going to do? How am I going to get out of there? And tries to be really quiet. And then eventually what leads to be, he starts to escape, he gets caught on a rock, and then the mushrooms come and take him to the dismay of the group who are watching. So that's the end of my chapters.
Alright. So chapter 16, or 17, it takes place with the group watching Minji as he's absorbing around the knoll, and they're looking, and Curly Green's really making sure that she's watching, and she says, he's there. I can see a little wiggle where he's climbing over the edge. And the group keeps watching him, and then she says, it says, then they saw them, the invaders, swarms of them pouring over Minji's rock. So then, once they see all the invaders coming, they race over to him to see if they can try and help him out, but they don't get to him in time before the invaders take him away. The group stays back to see if he he left a message, but Gummy keeps going to try and save Minji. But he comes back, and his shoulder has got a cut on it. So then 18 goes on, and they're helping out Gummy with his wound. And they bring him back to the house. But before that, they scout out the area, and they find the mushrooms had spears. And they're asking Gummy if he remembers anything. He says he doesn't really remember anything, but he saw nothing but the sword, the sparks from his sword. So okay, that's not really helping out. So they get the spears, and they find that there's a sticky red substance on this that isn't blood either. Walter says there is something on them. Muggle says, yes, I think it may be poison. So once they get Gummy back to the house, Walter the Earl heads down to the slip around the water to gather the villagers and form an army to stop the mushrooms. Curly Green and Muggles are left to tend Gummy and defend the house if anything is going to happen. But at that night, the mushrooms begin to attack Gummy's house. So then 19 goes on, and it's Walter the Earl down that slip of the water. And midway through going down to the village, he forgets that he forgot one of the spears, and this is just going to be proof that there are other people out there, because the periods are going to be too stubborn to believe that there's actually something other than the mini pins out there. So he goes straight to the mayor's house, and of course, what is it, Lidded?
Yeah.
Okay, Lidded and Co. just don't believe it, they don't buy it. So then Walter takes things into his own hands, and he runs around telling everybody about the invaders, saying the invaders are come, sound the alarms. It's kind of a short chapter, so then it goes on to chapter 20. And it's Minji. Minji wakes up in the mountain, and he's in the lair where all the mushrooms are. His foot's broken from being caught on the rock, and he's barely conscious. And the mushrooms are communicating with each other, just making weird noises. And it appears that they want to kill him, or at least eat him. But the leader, who has the biggest belly, he doesn't. He just gives them a bowl of soup that tastes nasty. So Minji drinks it, and then he passes out again. And he wakes up to the mushrooms dipping their spears into a pot of the red sticky substance. He doesn't know what it is yet, because it was the other group that discovered it. But he notices that one of the mushrooms is waving it around, just kind of warming himself up, and he hits one of the other mushrooms, and then there's just a canary going on. Everyone's freaking out because the guy's poisoned. So they rush the guy over to...
Did you say it was a canary?
They're having a canary.
Oh, no. That's awesome.
They rush him over to this pot of white stuff, and it appears that the white stuff heals and removes the poison from the mushroom. But then Minji passes out again. He wakes up again, still in the empty cave, and he realizes that the mushrooms are all out there to go kill the rest of the Minipins. And so he figures that if the Minipins got their army, he's going to figure out how to block this cave so the mushrooms can't escape to the outside world, and we can get rid of them right here and now. Then goes on to chapter 21, back at Walter the Earl's view. He's down at Slip of the Water, and preparations are being made for battle. They're making food, armor is being exchanged, and swords are passed around from the boxes that Walter the Earl discovered. It says, Walter the Earl hurried from one spot to another, directing operations, escorting the villagers to greater speeds. The periods, however, were not happy, and they were butting heads with Walter, trying to prevent the villagers from fighting, because they just didn't buy that there was something out there that they needed to fight. But in the midst of all of this, a cry from the mushrooms calls out, and everyone realizes, well, crap, they're coming. Walter says, "Sound the trumpets, advance the host, death to the invaders." Everyone looks at him and they go, "Okay, let's do this." So they answer, "Death to the invaders." Then it goes on to chapter 22, back at the house. Gummy is just near death. He can't really do much, and so it leaves up to Curly, Green, and Muggles to fend off the mushrooms that are trying to take over their house. Muggles runs around, and she's trying to get everybody to get the armor on, so that way they can protect themselves from the poisonous spears. While Curly Green is going around defending all the windows and the door, and then Muggles comes up with the idea to grab the shields to cover the door or the windows to block them, but then the mushrooms just keep coming. They don't let up. And that's where I am.
Alright. So chapter 23 starts with Minji still hurt inside the mountain. Minji knew he had to do something to trap the mushrooms. So as he was looking around, he found the mushroom sleeping mats. They had an awful smell, but Minji, limping, pulled the mats to stack them up high. Minji made sure to grab the white stuff that had the power to heal. Chapter 24 started with Walter the Earl marching his men fast along the bank of Little Trickle in the dark. The army of 50 marched. The sword then started to heat up and glow. The army of men began to hear, "Kin death, kin death, kin death." The army was split. Crambo and 10 warriors will start to circle the base. Then Brush and his 10 men will follow a few minutes later. The rest will stay put. Before them could signal for attack, the mushroom men chanted, "Kin death, kin death." The warriors surged forward onto the knoll. During the battle, the swords began to glow, showering fountains of light. Then the mushrooms fled in terror, but the glowing swords surrounded them. The mushrooms cleared from the knoll or ran to Little Trickle. Lidded, the reported 5 of the men wounded, none dead. Spill counted 67 dead mushrooms. The trumpets went, and so the Minipen warriors advanced the host to the invaders. Chapter 25 starts with the Minipens getting tired, and the mushrooms made it back into the mountain. Walter the Earl knew that if they tried going into the mountain, they would be faced by spears. Brush was standing by the mine's entrance when he smelled smoke, and then he heard, "Meek, meek," the mushrooms were coming back. The warriors were ready, and they knew they had been successful, but knew that Minji was still inside. Walter the Earl then said, "I want 10 warriors to enter the mountain with me." Every warrior stepped forward. But then Minji emerged from the mountain. He wore only one slipper, but had a smile on his face as he clung to the big metal pot. "Good morning," he cried, "for I see it is morning. Is there anything for breakfast?" Chapter 26 starts with the wounded warriors being healed with the mushroom's white cream. Walter the Earl and his 10 men were inside the mountain all morning. When they emerged, they shared that on the other side of the mountain it was nothing but gray. No trees, no plants, just gray. The army returned the next day, rested to slumber on the water, to everyone cheering and banners waving. Muggles went to dress Minji's foot. Then Minji said, "As soon as my foot is healed and I get a roof over my head, I will make you my wife." Lidded got on top of a box in front of the town and said how very proud he was of the 5. He then shared that the great ancestor was anything but magnificent. Then he was only but a foolish prank. He didn't make the balloon he stole for fun. Muggles was put on top of the box. She said, "I once said we weren't all the same color inside, but I know that was wrong. The night of the battle, we were all the same color, a sort of shimmering gold, like the ancient writing on the sword." Muggles in the town agreed that they no longer needed the Gammage Cup. The marketplace began to sing, "Here's to our mayor, our good Lidded the fair. Lidded was the wise, with far-seeing eyes. Oh, here's to Lidded the rare." The judges noticed everything in the marketplace, everyone cheering, and that's when they decided to leave the Gammage Cup. The end.